a cup of black coffee, and a slice of cherry pie. That was all State Senator Malcolm Ellison wanted during a quiet morning. But to Officer Curtis Mallory, a black man wearing a tailored charcoal suit inside Oakmont's most exclusive diner, was not a customer. He was a target. What followed would be captured by body cameras, a shocking abuse of authority, the metallic click of steel handcuffs, and one devastating telephone call from the governor's mansion that would end a career forever. Listen carefully, because the justice delivered in this story is absolute. Oakmont County was the kind of wealthy, isolated suburb where leafy tree canopies perfectly shaded immaculate streets and neighborhood watch members treated unfamiliar license plates like 5-alarm emergencies. Located outside the state capital, Oakmont was a protected sanctuary for old money, quiet influence, and carefully guarded political connections. State Senator Malcolm Ellison did not live there. At 52, with silver beginning to appear at his temples and a mind sharp enough to cut glass, Malcolm represented the 12th District, a busy, diverse metropolitan community that many Oakmont residents visited only when they had theater tickets. Before entering politics, Malcolm had been a civil rights attorney. He had climbed the punishing ladder of state government through determination, extraordinary intelligence, and an unshakable moral compass. He now chaired the state's most powerful judiciary committee. Malcolm had left home early to attend a private breakfast meeting with a representative whose vote was essential to an upcoming police reform bill. The meeting ended ahead of schedule, leaving Malcolm with time before he needed to return to the Capitol for a demanding legislative session. He guided his black Mercedes S-Class into the parking lot of the Oakmont Diner, a local institution known for its stained glass windows, deep leather booths, and blueberry pancakes. Malcolm stepped from the car, adjusted the cuffs of his custom Italian suit, picked up his leather briefcase, and entered the diner. The bell above the door chimed. It was a cheerful, innocent sound that briefly interrupted the low murmur of conversation. Only a handful of customers occupied the dining room. Several retirees sat reading newspapers, while 2 construction supervisors ate heavy breakfast before beginning their workday. Malcolm selected a corner booth and carefully placed his briefcase on the vinyl seat beside him. A young waitress named Tessa Lane approached with a tired but friendly smile and handed him a menu. "Good morning, sir. Would you like coffee to start?" "Black, please, Tessa, and a slice of cherry pie, assuming it is not too early for dessert," Malcolm replied. His voice was deep, smooth, and naturally commanding. Malcolm possessed an effortless dignity, an atmosphere of authority that inspired respect without ever demanding it. "It is never too early for pie, honey. I'll bring it right over," Tessa said with a genuine smile, warmed by his politeness. Malcolm opened his briefcase and removed a thick stack of briefing documents concerning the police reform bill. He uncapped a gold fountain pen and began reading. For a while, the world remained peaceful. The scent of freshly roasted coffee and sizzling bacon drifted through the diner. Then the bell above the entrance rang again. Officer Curtis Mallory walked inside. Mallory was 45, with extra weight pressing against the tactical vest beneath his uniform and a jaw permanently fixed in a resentful scowl. He was a veteran of the Oakmont Police Department, a powerful figure inside a small, carefully maintained community. Within the department, Mallory was known for what he called proactive policing. He considered himself Oakmont's gatekeeper, the loyal sheepdog protecting the community from dangerous wolves. But Mallory's definition of a wolf had been poisoned by deep, long-standing prejudice. His personnel file contained numerous civilian complaints, most involving harassment and excessive force. Yet the local police union and a sympathetic former chief had repeatedly buried those accusations. Mallory entered from the crisp air outside, slapping a pair of leather gloves against his palm. He nodded toward the diner manager, Nolan Briggs, who was wiping down the counter. "Morning, Curtis, the usual?" Nolan asked. "Black coffee to go." Mallory leaned against the counter and casually surveyed the dining room. It was a habit, his way of evaluating every person inside a space. His gaze passed over the retirees and the construction workers. Then it stopped at the corner booth. Mallory stopped chewing his gum. His eyes narrowed as he studied the black man wearing an expensive suit and reading official-looking documents. He glanced through the large front window and noticed the polished, late-model Mercedes parked outside. The vehicle carried license plates from another county. Inside Mallory's mind, a story immediately began forming. No one around Oakmont dressed like that on an ordinary weekday morning unless he was headed to court. The car was probably leased. Perhaps it was stolen. The man did not belong there. A toxic mixture of arrogance and prejudice began simmering inside Mallory's chest. He did not see a public servant preparing for a legislative session. He saw an irregularity that needed to be investigated, challenged, and reminded of where he was. Tessa walked past Mallory carrying Malcolm's coffee and cherry pie. Who is the man in the corner? Mallory muttered. Tessa stopped and looked confused. Him? He's just a customer. He ordered coffee and pie. He has been very polite. I haven't seen him around here before, Mallory grunted. He pushed himself away from the counter without waiting for his coffee. Mallory adjusted his duty belt, ensuring that his radio, taser, and service weapon were positioned exactly where he wanted them. Then he began a long, deliberate walk across the diner's black and white checkered floor. From the corner of his vision, Malcolm noticed the uniformed officer approaching. A lifetime spent as a black man in America, combined with decades of civil rights work, had sharpened his awareness to a razor's edge. He recognized the walk. He understood the posture. It was the aggressive stride of a man searching for an excuse to use his authority. Malcolm did not immediately look up. He took a slow sip of coffee, turned a page in his briefing packet, and waited for the officer's shadow to fall across the table. The heavy impact of police boots stopped beside the booth. Mallory stood uncomfortably close, one hand resting casually but deliberately on his belt beside the taser. "Morning," he said. The word sounded like a greeting, but its tone carried the force of an interrogation. Malcolm calmly finished the sentence he was reading, placed the cap on his fountain pen, and finally lifted his eyes. He met Mallory's hard stare with an expression that was perfectly calm but entirely unyielding. "Good morning, officer," Malcolm replied. Mallory continued chewing his gum as he looked Malcolm over. Then he glanced toward the Mercedes outside. "Nice car. Does it belong to you?" "It does," Malcolm answered neutrally. He did not ask what Mallory wanted. He did not offer an anxious smile or begin explaining himself. He simply answered and waited. That absence of submission immediately irritated Mallory. He was accustomed to civilians becoming nervous, speaking too quickly, offering unnecessary explanations, or shrinking under the weight of his presence. "What brings you to Oakmont?" Mallory asked, leaning forward and entering Malcolm's personal space. "Breakfast," Malcolm answered, gesturing toward the partially eaten slice of cherry pie. "Don't get clever with me. I asked you a question. You don't look like you're from around here. I was unaware that Oakmont required local residency before someone could eat inside one of its diners, officer." Malcolm allowed his eyes to move toward the officer's nameplate. "Officer Mallory." Mallory's face flushed. The quiet intelligence and natural command in Malcolm's voice felt insulting to him. "We've had burglaries in the area," Mallory said. "Expensive homes have been targeted, and there has been a lot of suspicious activity." He shifted closer. "I'm conducting a routine check. I need to see your identification." The diner, which had been filled with soft conversation and the quiet clatter of silverware, became silent. The retirees at the nearby table lowered their newspapers. Tessa stopped refilling a sugar container and stared with widened eyes. Everyone was watching. Malcolm did not reach for his wallet. He remained perfectly still. He understood the law better than the officer who had been trained to enforce it. Malcolm had personally helped revise portions of the state code governing search and seizure. "Officer Mallory," he said, without raising his voice, "unless I am mistaken, this state has no stop and identify statute requiring a citizen to present identification merely because an officer requests it." His tone remained calm and precise. "Furthermore, under Terry v. Ohio, you must possess reasonable, articulable suspicion that I have committed, am committing, or am about to commit a crime before you may lawfully detain me." Malcolm glanced at the pie. "Does eating cherry pie while black constitute reasonable suspicion in Oakmont?" The question struck Mallory like a physical blow. No one spoke to him that way, especially not the people he normally targeted. The reference to constitutional law, Malcolm's total absence of fear, and his direct exposure of Mallory's racial assumptions pushed the officer into an ego-driven rage. "Listen to me, you arrogant piece of work," Mallory hissed, abandoning every appearance of politeness. He slammed one palm against the table. Malcolm's coffee cup rattled against its saucer. "I don't care about whatever cheap legal education you think you have. I told you there have been burglaries." Mallory pointed toward the window. "You're driving an expensive car, you're out of place, and you are refusing a lawful order from a police officer." His voice became more threatening. "Show me your identification or the situation is going to become extremely unpleasant." Nolan Briggs hurried from behind the counter, nervously wiping his hands against his apron. "Curtis, come on, he's only having breakfast. He already paid. There's no reason to create a scene." "Back away, Nolan. This is police business," Mallory barked without looking away from Malcolm. Nolan raised his hands and retreated, powerless before the badge. Malcolm slowly uncrossed his legs and placed both feet firmly on the floor. He looked toward the officer's chest. "Is your body camera recording, Officer Mallory?" Mallory sneered. "Yes, it's recording. It will capture you resisting." "Excellent," Malcolm replied. "Then let the record show that I am sitting inside a public establishment and minding my own business." His words were deliberate and legally precise. "I have violated Violated no law. I am not behaving suspiciously. You have provided no lawful justification for demanding my identification. Malcolm held the officer's gaze. I am therefore refusing your unlawful request. He paused. Am I free to leave, or are you detaining me? It was a flawless demonstration of legal control, and Mallory had been verbally cornered. But men driven by unchecked authority and wounded pride rarely think clearly. Mallory saw only humiliation. He could feel the eyes of every customer inside the diner watching him. Backing down would make him appear weak. It would mean admitting that he had been defeated by the exact kind of man he despised. You are not going anywhere, Mallory growled. He stepped backward and released the retention strap on his holster. It was a small gesture of intimidation, but it carried deadly meaning. You are officially detained for interfering with a police investigation and obstruction. Stand up. Malcolm looked at the unfastened holster. He understood the danger immediately. He was a state senator, but inside that diner, he was also an unarmed black man facing an enraged officer carrying a firearm. Any sudden movement or perceived act of aggression could end his life. I will stand, Malcolm said carefully. He raised his hands, keeping them clearly visible. I am complying with your physical commands under duress. However, I am stating for your body camera that this detention is unlawful. Stand up and turn around. Put your hands behind your back, Mallory shouted, his voice cracking with adrenaline. Malcolm slid from the booth and rose to his full height. At 6 feet 2 inches, he towered over the stocky officer. The difference in size only intensified Mallory's anger. Turn around, he yelled. Mallory seized Malcolm by the shoulder and violently spun him toward the table. The physical contact crossed a serious legal and moral boundary. He drove Malcolm's chest against the edge of the table, knocking over the coffee. Dark liquid poured across the white saucer and soaked into the briefing documents. They were the very papers outlining the police reform legislation Malcolm was fighting to pass. Put your hands behind your back, Mallory ordered, pressing his forearm into Malcolm's spine. Malcolm offered no resistance. He calmly moved both hands behind him and interlaced his fingers. I am not resisting, Officer Mallory. I am fully compliant. Mallory removed the handcuffs from his belt. The sound of the metal chain was sharp and chilling inside the silent diner. The heavy steel closed tightly around Malcolm's wrists. Mallory deliberately tightened the cuffs an additional notch, forcing the metal painfully into his skin. Malcolm winced, but made no sound. You have the right to remain silent, Mallory began, breathing heavily as he recited the Miranda warning. He pulled Malcolm backward by the chain connecting the cuffs. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. The diner's customers watched in shock. A teenage boy seated near the window held up his smartphone and recorded everything. Tessa covered her mouth with both hands as tears formed in her eyes. It was a grotesque display of unjustified humiliation. Let's move, Mallory snarled. He gripped Malcolm's upper arm and marched him toward the entrance. Officer, Malcolm said calmly as they crossed the silent diner, you are making a monumental mistake, one that will permanently change the course of your life. Save it for the judge, Mallory answered with a mocking laugh. I have heard every excuse. Every criminal believes he is untouchable. Mallory pushed open the diner door and forced Malcolm into the cool air outside. The rising sun cast a bright, unforgiving light across the parking lot. Mallory marched Malcolm toward the patrol cruiser, pressed him against the side of the vehicle, and searched him aggressively. He kicked Malcolm's ankles apart, forcing his legs into a wider stance. A second Oakmont patrol cruiser suddenly entered the parking lot with its emergency lights flashing and stopped sharply nearby. Mallory had activated his emergency radio button during the confrontation inside the diner. Officer Damon Pierce stepped from the vehicle. Pierce was 24 and had only recently graduated from the police academy. Unlike Mallory, he still possessed a conscience. He hurried toward the scene with one hand resting on his duty belt. Curtis, what happened? You activated the emergency signal. Pierce studied the scene. He saw an impeccably dressed man in handcuffs pressed against a patrol car. Then he noticed the pristine Mercedes nearby. Something immediately felt wrong. I have a non-compliant suspect, Mallory said proudly, struggling to catch his breath. He refused to identify himself, matched the profile connected to the burglaries, and resisted detention. I'm charging him with obstruction. Pierce looked toward Malcolm. Malcolm turned his head, rested his cheek against the cold surface of the cruiser, and stared directly into the rookie's eyes. Officer, Malcolm said. His voice was no longer merely polite. It carried the powerful authority of a state senator accustomed to commanding rooms filled with hundreds of people. My name is Malcolm Ellison. Your senior officer has unlawfully assaulted and arrested me without cause. Malcolm continued steadily. Since he appears determined to transport me to the station, I recommend that you retrieve my identification. It is inside the left breast pocket of my suit jacket. Mallory laughed harshly. Now he wants to show identification. It is too late for that. They can identify him at the station after running his fingerprints. Pierce felt a cold knot form inside his stomach. The handcuffed man did not sound like a burglar. He sounded like a judge. Curtis, Pierce said hesitantly, let me check the pocket. Procedure recommends confirming identification before transport whenever possible. Mallory rolled his eyes. Fine, search the expensive suit. He probably has a fake identification card. Pierce stepped closer. Excuse me, sir, he said respectfully. He reached inside Malcolm's Brioni suit jacket. His fingers touched a thick, premium leather wallet. Pierce removed it and opened the cover. Behind the transparent window was not an ordinary driver's license. It was a beautifully embossed gold identification card. Across the top, in bold and unmistakable lettering, were the words, State Senate. Beneath the title was a high-quality photograph of the man currently standing in handcuffs. Below the photograph were the words, Senator Malcolm Ellison, Chairman Judiciary Committee. Pierce stopped breathing. The color vanished from his face. His hands began trembling visibly. He read the card repeatedly before slowly lifting his eyes toward Malcolm. Curtis, Pierce stammered. What? Mallory snapped. Does he have outstanding warrants? Pierce turned the wallet around and extended it with shaking fingers. Curtis, he whispered, terror filling his voice. He is a state senator. Mallory froze. The arrogant expression disappeared from his face, replaced by a sickening emptiness. He stared at the gold card. Then he read Malcolm's name. Malcolm Ellison was the man who influenced the state's law enforcement budget. He also led the police reform task force. The morning breeze suddenly felt like ice against Mallory's skin. For the first time in his career, Officer Curtis Mallory realized that he might have destroyed his own life. Malcolm slowly turned his head. His eyes were as cold and deep as the ocean. As I told you, Officer Mallory, he said quietly, you have made a monumental mistake. Silence consumed the diner parking lot. Only the low hum of the two Oakmont police cruisers could be heard. Officer Pierce remained frozen, holding the state senate credential in trembling hands. He looked like a man who had accidentally pulled the pin from a grenade and discovered that it was impossible to release. Mallory stared at the embossed lettering. Blood pounded in his ears, drowning out the sounds of the morning. His mind searched desperately for a loophole, some explanation that might protect him. During his years in uniform, Mallory had intimidated and falsely accused many people who lacked the money or influence to challenge him. He relied on the badge as a shield against consequences, but Malcolm Ellison was not a powerless teenager from a poor neighborhood. He was a state senator who sat on the Appropriations Committee and possessed the authority to freeze financial support for municipal police departments. Curtis, Pierce whispered, remove the handcuffs immediately, take them off and apologize. For one brief moment, self-preservation almost overcame Mallory's pride. His hand moved toward the keys attached to his belt. Then his fragile and toxic ego took control again. The teenager inside the diner was still recording. The retirees continued watching. Removing the cuffs would mean admitting on camera that he had racially profiled, unlawfully detained, and assaulted a sitting state senator. His career might already be finished. In Mallory's distorted mind, the only path forward was to continue. He needed to make the obstruction charge appear legitimate and hope that police union attorneys could create enough confusion to protect his pension. No, Mallory said, his voice falling into a stubborn growl. He snatched the credential wallet from Pierce and shoved it into a pocket on his tactical vest. No one is above the law, not even politicians. Mallory glared at Malcolm. He refused a lawful order to identify himself during an active burglary investigation. That is obstruction. He is going to the station. Pierce looked at his senior officer with undisguised horror. Are you insane? You had no probable cause. This is false arrest, Curtis. This is a federal civil rights violation. Be quiet, rookie, Mallory shouted. He turned away from Pierce and grabbed Malcolm's arm. Mallory shoved him toward the rear door of the cruiser. Watch your head. Malcolm did not resist. He lowered his head and entered the hard plastic rear compartment. Then he looked up at Mallory through the open door. There was no fear in Malcolm's eyes. There was only cold professional observation. I want you to remember this moment, Officer Mallory, he said evenly as the handcuffs pressed deeper into his wrists. Your colleague just offered you an opportunity to reduce the consequences of your actions. Malcolm's gaze hardened. You chose instead to continue committing a felony civil rights violation under color of law. He leaned slightly forward. You are no longer facing only the loss of your badge. You are exposing yourself to a federal indictment. Mallory slammed the door, cutting off Malcolm's voice. He stormed toward the driver's seat, breathing heavily, his face flushed with anger. Mallory entered the cruiser and shifted it violently into gear. Officer Pierce did not return to his own patrol car. He remained in the parking lot and removed his personal phone. His hands shook so badly that the device slipped from his fingers. After retrieving it, he called the precinct's emergency desk line. Pierce understood that he needed to report what had happened before Mallory pulled the entire department into disaster. Inside Mallory's cruiser, the atmosphere was thick and suffocating. A plexiglass partition separated the enraged officer from his prisoner, but the tension passed easily through it. Mallory drove aggressively and entered turns too quickly, his knuckles white against the steering wheel. He tried to project authority, yet Malcolm's silence was destroying his nerves. Most arrested people shouted, cried, begged, or cursed. Malcolm Ellison did none of those things. He sat perfectly upright, maintaining flawless posture despite having his hands restrained behind him. He carefully recorded every detail in his mind. The patrol car number, the route, Mallory's speed, the language used, and every procedural violation. Malcolm was constructing a federal lawsuit, one undeniable piece at a time. "You think you're intelligent, don't you?" Mallory sneered, looking into the rearview mirror. He could no longer endure the silence. "You think that gold identification card gives you permission to disrespect law enforcement?" "I believe," Malcolm replied calmly, "that the Constitution of the United States applies equally to everyone, regardless of the neighborhood in which he chooses to eat breakfast." His voice remained clear through the partition. "That is a principle you appear fundamentally incapable of understanding. We'll see how arrogant you are inside a holding cell," Mallory snapped. He unnecessarily activated the siren and drove through a red traffic signal. Soon afterward, the cruiser entered the secure rear garage of the Oakmont Police Department. The modest brick building normally handled noise complaints, vandalism, minor theft, and traffic violations. It was completely unprepared for the political disaster sitting inside Mallory's patrol car. Mallory stepped out, opened the rear door, and dragged Malcolm from the vehicle by the collar of his jacket. "Move." They passed through heavy steel doors and entered the booking area. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. The room smelled of floor wax and stale coffee. Behind the elevated booking desk sat Sergeant Vernon Caldwell, a 30-year police veteran nearing retirement. He had been drinking coffee while reading a sports magazine. Caldwell looked up as the reinforced doors closed. "Morning, Curtis. What do we have?" he asked casually, setting down the magazine and logging into the booking computer. "Burglary suspect, obstruction and resisting," Mallory announced loudly as he marched Malcolm toward the counter. He refused to identify himself and became belligerent. Caldwell studied the handcuffed man. He noticed the expensive Italian suit stained with spilled coffee, Malcolm's impeccable grooming, and his quiet, authoritative presence. Caldwell frowned. After decades in law enforcement, he had developed an instinct for recognizing when something was seriously wrong. This situation felt catastrophically wrong. "Name?" Caldwell asked Malcolm. Before Malcolm could answer, the rear doors burst open. Officer Pierce ran into the booking area, breathing heavily, his uniform disordered from the rush. "Sergeant, stop," he shouted, waving his hands. "Do not process him." Caldwell rose from his chair and reached toward his radio. "Pierce, what's wrong with you? Catch your breath." Pierce hurried to the booking desk. He ignored Mallory and looked directly at the sergeant. "Do not book him. Do not enter him into the system." "What are you talking about?" Mallory demanded, stepping forward. "I am the arresting officer. Stay out of this." Pierce turned and pointed toward him with a trembling hand. "He detained that man without probable cause. I was there, Sergeant. I witnessed it." Pierce swallowed before turning toward Malcolm. "Tell him who you are, sir." Malcolm stepped forward with his hands still cuffed behind his back. He looked toward Sergeant Caldwell. "My name is State Senator Malcolm Ellison," he said, his voice echoing through the booking room. "I chair the Senate Judiciary Committee, and your officers just abducted me." Caldwell stared at him. Every trace of color vanished from the older sergeant's face. He knew that name. Every law enforcement officer in the state knew it. Caldwell looked toward Mallory with a mixture of rage and terror. "Curtis, tell me you did not do this." Mallory lifted his chin defiantly. "He refused an order, Sergeant. I was doing my job." Caldwell slammed his fist against the booking desk. The impact cracked through the room and made both officers flinch. "You arrogant fool," Caldwell roared. "Get the captain down here immediately." Captain Roland Mercer was conducting a departmental briefing upstairs when his telephone produced the emergency internal signal. He answered with visible irritation. Moments later, Mercer rushed down the stairwell, nearly losing his footing. He entered the booking area and stopped abruptly. State Senator Malcolm Ellison stood silently near the counter. Officer Pierce leaned against the wall and looked physically ill. Mallory stood rigidly with his arms crossed, desperately attempting to appear defiant while sweat gathered across his forehead. Sergeant Caldwell stood behind the booking desk with both hands pressed against his head. Captain Mercer immediately recognized Malcolm. He had attended a recent state law enforcement fundraising event and personally shaken the senator's hand. "Dear God," Mercer whispered. He rushed forward and pushed Mallory aside so forcefully that the larger officer stumbled. Mercer stopped in front of Malcolm. "Senator Ellison," he said, panic filling his voice. "Sir, I cannot begin to express—" "Captain," Malcolm interrupted, his voice cold and exact. "Remove these handcuffs immediately." "Keys!" Mercer shouted as he turned toward Mallory. "Give me the keys!" Mallory finally understood that the police union would not protect him from his own captain. He reached nervously toward his belt and handed Mercer the small silver key. Mercer's hands shook as he moved behind Malcolm and unlocked the cuffs. The metal restraints fell away. Malcolm slowly brought his arms forward. His wrists were bruised and bright red where the steel had cut into his skin. He calmly straightened the sleeves of his suit and adjusted the cuffs over the injuries. He did not rub his wrists. He showed no pain. He simply looked at the captain. "Senator, please come into my office," Mercer pleaded, gesturing toward the secured hallway. "I will get you fresh coffee. We can sit down and resolve this. It was an enormous misunderstanding." "This was not a misunderstanding, Captain Mercer," Malcolm answered. "It was a crime." His tone allowed no negotiation. "I will not sit inside your office. I will remain here, and I have 3 immediate demands." "Anything," Mercer said, "whatever you require." Malcolm pointed toward Sergeant Caldwell. "First, Officer Mallory's body camera footage will be isolated immediately." He looked directly at Mercer. "You will remove the server drive and place it into an evidence bag while I am present." Malcolm's voice sharpened. "If a single frame disappears or becomes corrupted, I will personally ensure that the FBI dismantles this precinct down to its foundation." "Sergeant, secure the drive immediately," Mercer ordered. Caldwell began typing rapidly at the computer. "Second," Malcolm continued, turning toward Mallory, who was visibly shrinking against the wall, "Officer Mallory will be stripped of his badge, service weapon, and police authority pending full internal and state investigations." "You cannot do that," Mallory shouted. Panic finally broke through his arrogant facade. "The union agreement requires—" "Close your mouth, Mallory," Mercer roared, his face darkening with fury. "Give me your weapon and badge. You are suspended without pay, effective immediately." Mallory stared at his captain. The protection he had trusted was gone. Slowly, with shaking hands, he removed his duty belt and surrendered it. Then he unpinned the gold shield from his chest. Without his weapon and badge, Mallory suddenly looked small. He was no longer an intimidating police officer. He was merely an angry and frightened man who had challenged someone far more powerful and lost. "Third," Malcolm said quietly, "I want my telephone." He looked toward Mercer. "It is inside my briefcase, which Officer Mallory left in the front passenger seat of his cruiser." "Pierce, retrieve the senator's briefcase," Mercer ordered. Pierce rushed through the rear doors. He quickly returned carrying the expensive leather case and presented it to Malcolm, as though it were made of glass. Malcolm set the briefcase on the booking counter and released the brass locks. He reached inside and removed his smartphone. The screen displayed numerous unread messages from staff members who were wondering why he had not arrived at the Capitol. "Are you calling your attorney, Senator?" Mercer asked nervously, twisting his hands together. "We can have the municipal attorney here immediately." "I am an attorney, Captain," Malcolm replied sharply. "I do not need legal counsel." He unlocked the phone. "I need the executive branch." Malcolm bypassed his normal contacts and called a private number known to only a handful of officials throughout the state. He raised the phone to his ear. The booking area became completely silent. Even the electrical hum of the lights appeared to fade. Mallory watched as a bottomless feeling of dread opened inside him. He understood exactly who Malcolm intended to contact. The call connected, and a crisp professional voice answered. "Executive Office, Chief of Staff speaking." "Everett, this is Malcolm Ellison. Senator, we have been trying to locate you. The committee session is about to begin, and the governor has been asking for you." "I am going to be delayed," Malcolm said. "Connect me with Alistair immediately." A brief silence followed. The chief of staff recognized the deadly seriousness in Malcolm's voice. "I'm transferring you now." The line clicked. Then the deep, familiar voice of Governor Alistair Grant came through the phone. "Malcolm, good morning. Tell me you secured Representative Bellamy's vote for the reform bill." "I have the vote," Malcolm replied. His eyes locked onto Mallory, who leaned against the wall and looked physically sick. "But we have a more urgent matter involving the police reform initiative." Malcolm's voice hardened. "I have just received a personal demonstration of precisely why the legislation is necessary." "What happened? You don't sound as though you are at the Capitol." "I'm not." Malcolm paused. "I am standing inside the booking area of the Oakmont Police Department." He continued calmly. "I was physically assaulted. unlawfully arrested, and handcuffed inside a public diner by one of their officers for the crime of drinking coffee while black. A profound silence followed. When the governor spoke again, his friendly political manner had completely disappeared. It had been replaced by the ruthless authority of the state's highest executive. "Who is the commanding officer standing in the room with you?" Governor Grant asked, his voice as cold as breaking ice. Malcolm looked toward Captain Mercer, whose uniform shirt was becoming damp with sweat. Captain Roland Mercer, "Place me on speaker." Malcolm lowered the telephone, activated the speaker, and placed it carefully on the booking counter. "Governor Grant, you are now speaking with Captain Mercer." Mercer leaned toward the phone. His voice trembled. "Governor Grant? Good morning, sir." "Captain Mercer," the governor said, his voice filling the small room, "explain immediately why the chairman of my Judiciary Committee is standing inside your booking area with injured wrists." His words sharpened. "If I do not receive a satisfactory answer, I will send a state police tactical unit to remove you from command and assume control of your precinct." In the corner, stripped of his weapon and badge, Mallory closed his eyes. With terrifying clarity, he understood that the world he had known was ending. "Governor, this was an isolated incident," Mercer stammered. "It was an unauthorized action by Officer Mallory. I have already removed his badge and firearm. He has been suspended." "Suspended?" Governor Grant repeated. His barely controlled fury echoed from the speaker. "Captain, we are discussing the chairman of the State Judiciary Committee, the man responsible for rewriting this state's law enforcement code." His voice rose. "You do not suspend an officer who abducts a state senator. You arrest him." The room became motionless. "I am sending State Attorney General Preston Vale and a state police unit to your location." The governor continued. "Secure the entire building. No one leaves. Not you, not your desk sergeant, and certainly not the disgraced officer standing in the corner." "Yes, Governor, I understand completely," Mercer answered. His eyes moved across the booking room as though the walls were closing around him. "Malcolm," the governor said, softening slightly, "are you injured? Do you require medical assistance?" "My wrists are bruised, Alistair, but I am fine," Malcolm replied. He removed the call from the speaker and raised the phone to his ear. "I will remain here until the Attorney General arrives. I want a complete chain of custody established for the body camera footage." "Vale is already traveling with the state police escort," the governor said. "Give them hell, Malcolm." "Always." Malcolm ended the call and returned the phone to his jacket pocket. The silence inside the precinct became suffocating. Officer Pierce appeared close to becoming physically ill. Sergeant Caldwell typed rapidly, ensuring that the body camera server logs were preserved and permanently archived. Then the secure doors leading from the public lobby opened violently. Conrad Blake, the regional representative of the Police Benevolent Association, entered the room. Blake was an aggressive, thick-set man wearing an inexpensive gray suit. Throughout Oakmont County, he was known for defending corrupt officers from consequences. Mallory had managed to send him a desperate message while Malcolm's handcuffs were being removed. Blake entered with his chest pushed forward and a synthetic leather briefcase in one hand. He did not look at Malcolm. His attention went directly to Captain Mercer. "Captain," Blake shouted, "I am formally invoking my client's garrity rights." He set his briefcase on the counter. "Officer Mallory will not answer questions. I understand you confiscated his badge without conducting a union hearing." Blake pointed toward Mercer. "That violates the collective bargaining agreement, and you know it. We will sue this department for breach of contract." He turned toward Mallory and gestured toward the exit. "Come on, Curtis. Do not say anything. We are leaving." Mallory did not move. He remained against the concrete wall with wide, empty eyes. He looked toward Blake and slowly pointed a trembling finger at Malcolm. Only then did the union representative turn. Blake studied the black man standing calmly beside the booking counter. He noticed the spilled coffee across the expensive suit and the raw, red injuries around Malcolm's wrists. Assuming Malcolm was an ordinary civilian whose complaint could be dismissed, Blake sneered. "Is this the man?" he asked contemptuously. "Listen, whatever you believe happened, my officer was operating within his discretionary authority." Blake gestured toward the lobby. "There's a civilian complaint form available outside, but my client is leaving." Malcolm slowly closed his briefcase and rested both hands on top of it. His piercing stare caused Blake to take an instinctive step backward. "Mr. Blake, correct?" Malcolm asked. His voice was quiet and dangerous. Yes, Conrad Blake, Police Benevolent Association representative. And who are you? My name is Senator Malcolm Ellison. Malcolm held the union representative's gaze. I chair the committee responsible for determining whether your union pension fund receives state-matched contributions during the next fiscal year. Blake's mouth fell open. His aggressive confidence vanished instantly. His eyes moved toward Captain Mercer, who gave him a grim nod. Oh my God, Blake whispered as the color drained from his face. Your client is not leaving this building, Malcolm continued. The governor has dispatched the Attorney General and a state police tactical unit to secure this facility. He took a slow step toward Blake. Your client unlawfully detained me, physically assaulted me, and committed a felony civil rights violation while his body camera recorded the entire incident. Malcolm towered over the union representative. You may invoke whatever administrative protections you believe appropriate. His voice dropped. However, your client is no longer facing merely an internal affairs review. He is facing federal prosecution. Malcolm's expression hardened. If you interfere with this investigation, I will personally ensure that you are identified as a co-conspirator in the Department of Justice inquiry. He paused. Do we understand one another? Blake swallowed. The sound was audible inside the quiet room. He slowly stepped away from Mallory. Police union loyalty was powerful, but Conrad Blake had no intention of entering federal prison to protect a racist patrol officer. I understand, Senator, he muttered. Blake did not look at Mallory again. Soon afterward, the sound of tires echoed from the rear parking lot. Heavy boots struck the steps. 4 state troopers wearing tactical equipment entered the booking room behind a tall, sharp-eyed man in a dark navy suit. It was State Attorney General Preston Vail. Vail ignored the local officers and walked directly toward Malcolm. He extended his hand. Senator Ellison, I apologize for the delay. The governor briefed me during the journey. Thank you, Preston, Malcolm said, shaking his hand firmly. The most important evidence is Officer Mallory's body camera recording. Sergeant Caldwell has isolated the server drive. Vail nodded and turned toward the state troopers. Secure the perimeter. No one enters or leaves without my direct authorization. He looked toward Captain Mercer. We are taking control of the main briefing room. Vail's expression became severe. I want the body camera footage displayed on the projector. Every officer involved in this arrest will be present. The precinct's upstairs briefing room had been designed for routine roll calls, not a state-level tribunal. The fluorescent lights were dimmed. A large projection screen hung at the front of the room. Senator Malcolm Ellison sat in the front row with his arms crossed. Attorney General Vail sat beside him. Behind them stood Captain Mercer, Officer Pierce, and the defeated Union representative Conrad Blake. Curtis Mallory sat in a hard plastic chair at the center of the room, flanked by 2 armed state troopers. He was trembling. The adrenaline had disappeared, leaving behind only the cold, nauseating terror of complete ruin. Play the recording, Sergeant, Vail ordered. Caldwell sat at the media computer and selected the file. The screen flickered. The video showed Mallory's perspective with the recording information displayed in the corner. Audio filled the room, the sound of the diner bell and the low murmur of customers talking. They watched Mallory approach the corner booth. They heard his aggressive and unjustified questions. They saw him stare at the expensive car outside and question why Malcolm was present in Oakmont. They watched Malcolm calmly and legally refuse to provide identification. Then they saw Mallory lose control. His hand struck the table. Coffee spilled across the legislative documents. You are not going anywhere, Mallory's recorded voice said. You are officially detained. The room watched in terrible silence as Mallory assaulted the senator and forced him against the table. The metallic sound of the handcuffs closing echoed from the speakers. Attorney General Vail's expression became a mask of cold fury. He wrote rapidly on a legal pad. The recording showed Mallory marching Malcolm toward the cruiser. It captured Officer Pierce arriving and discovering the state Senate credential. Then it showed Mallory deliberately ignoring the identification and continuing the unlawful arrest. But what followed transformed a serious incident into a catastrophe for the entire Oakmont Police Department. On the screen, Mallory slammed the cruiser door and trapped Malcolm inside. He walked toward the front of the patrol vehicle where Officer Pierce stood looking horrified. The body camera audio remained clear. Curtis, this is false arrest, Pierce pleaded in the recording. This is a federal civil rights violation. Mallory's voice answered with unmistakable arrogance. Be quiet, rookie. Do what we always do. Every person in the briefing room became still. We'll write the report the way we handled the Brooks kid, Mallory continued on the recording. We'll put a little powder in the floorboards at the impound lot. His voice remained casual. We'll say he matched the description of a fleeing suspect and lock him up. The judges in this county believe whatever I write. Mallory laughed. We control this town. Sergeant Caldwell paused the recording. The silence inside the briefing room was no longer merely tense. It was lethal. Malcolm slowly turned toward Captain Mercer. The captain looked as though he had been struck in the chest. "Captain," Malcolm said, his voice deadly quiet, "who is the Brooks kid?" Mercer could not answer. His breathing became rapid and shallow. Attorney General Vale slowly rose. He looked toward Mallory, who was now crying openly with his face buried in his hands. "Terrence Brooks," Vale said, answering for the captain. "He was 18 when Officer Mallory arrested him for narcotics possession and resisting arrest." Vale's voice remained controlled. "He is currently serving a 3-year state prison sentence." He looked toward Malcolm. Brooks claimed that the drugs were planted. This department cleared Mallory of wrongdoing. Malcolm stood. He walked toward the chair where Mallory sat. The 2 state troopers became alert, but Malcolm did not touch the officer. He simply looked down at the sobbing man. "You did not merely racially profile me, Officer Mallory," Malcolm said. His voice carried the weight of absolute justice. "You exposed a systematic pattern of corruption, evidence tampering, and perjury." Malcolm glanced toward the body camera attached to Mallory's uniform. "You believed your badge protected you?" His eyes hardened. "Instead, it recorded your confession." Malcolm turned toward Attorney General Vale. "Preston, I do not want only this officer arrested." His voice filled the room. "I want the Department of Justice to investigate this entire precinct." Malcolm continued. "I want every arrest report Curtis Mallory filed throughout his career reviewed. I want Terrence Brooks's conviction reopened immediately. His final demand carried unmistakable authority. And I want the mayor of Oakmont in my office before the end of the day." "Consider it done, Senator," Vale replied. He gestured toward the troopers. "Take Curtis Mallory into custody." Vale listed the charges: false imprisonment, assault under color of law, official misconduct, and conspiracy to tamper with evidence. The troopers pulled Mallory from the chair. The man who had terrorized Oakmont for years did not resist. He was completely broken. Steel handcuffs closed around his wrists. The poetic justice of that sound was understood by everyone in the room. The troopers escorted Mallory from the briefing room. Malcolm picked up his briefcase. Then he turned toward Officer Pierce, who remained near the wall, still trembling but standing upright. "Officer Pierce," Malcolm said. Pierce immediately stood at attention. "Yes, sir." "You made the correct choice today. You attempted to stop what was happening." Malcolm looked toward the young officer. "When the state assumes control of this department, and it will, we will need officers with integrity to rebuild it." His expression softened slightly. "Keep your record clean." "I will, Senator, thank you," Pierce whispered. Malcolm Ellison left the briefing room, descended the stairs, and walked through the front entrance of the Oakmont Police Department. The sun shone brightly outside. His black Mercedes had been brought from the diner and was waiting at the curb with the keys inside, delivered by a terrified desk officer. Malcolm opened his briefcase and removed the coffee-stained briefing documents concerning the police reform bill. He spread them across the roof of the car and smoothed the pages with both hands. He no longer needed the documents. He now possessed all the evidence required to pass the legislation unanimously. Malcolm entered the driver's seat, adjusted his tie, and headed toward the state capitol. Justice had been delivered in Oakmont. But for Senator Malcolm Ellison, the real work was only beginning. Absolute power corrupts. True justice, however, always leaves evidence behind, sometimes in official documents and sometimes in body camera footage. Officer Curtis Mallory believed his badge made him untouchable. He challenged the wrong man and lost everything. A broken system changes only when the truth is dragged into the light. If you enjoyed watching arrogance collapse beneath intelligence and lawful authority, press the like button. Share this story with anyone who believes in accountability and justice, and subscribe for more intense, true-to-life dramatic stories. Leave a comment and tell us what you would have done in Senator Malcolm Ellison's position.